The forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, almost deliberate, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Shafts of sunlight barely pierced the thick canopy, casting long, shifting shadows across the uneven ground. Every step the archaeologists took was accompanied by the crunch of leaves, yet it felt as though some unseen eyes were tracking their movements. This was not a place where one came casually. Locals avoided it, whispering warnings about disappearances, strange noises at night, and legends of people vanishing without a trace. Some called it cursed, others claimed it was protected by forces they dared not name. Whatever the truth, the air carried a weight, a quiet tension that settled deep into the bones. Dr. Elena Reyes, the lead archaeologist, paused at the edge of the clearing. Her team had been preparing for this expedition for months, combing through historical records, old maps, and barely legible manuscripts. Yet standing here, on the brink of the forbidden site, all their meticulous planning seemed fragile. The ground beneath them was littered with broken pottery shards and fragments of stone that suggested long-forgotten human activity. But the deeper, darker history, the reason the site had remained untouched for decades, was still hidden. Elena ran her fingers over the damp earth, feeling the faint vibrations of the forest, a subtle reminder that they were not entirely alone. The team had chosen this location based on hints found in obscure records, tales of missing villagers, whispers of violent conflict, and accounts of a grave so vast that it was best left untouched. They arrived with tools, cameras, and scanners, ready to uncover history, but also aware of the risks. Some members had joked nervously about ghosts or curses, laughter masking unease. Others, more pragmatic, argued that fear should never guide science. Yet even the skeptics could not deny the uneasy sensation pressing in from all sides. There was something about this site that resisted discovery, as if the earth itself was hiding secrets it did not want revealed. As they began clearing away the surface debris, a subtle shift in the soil caught Elena's eye. A small fragment of bone peeked out from under a layer of moss and dirt. She froze, heart pounding, the world narrowing to that single, fragile piece of evidence. The fragment was human, unmistakably so. She signaled to the team, who gathered around in hushed disbelief. Nobody spoke at first, the only sound was the forest whine through the trees. The fragment was tiny, almost insignificant, yet it hinted at something enormous buried beneath. Questions raced through Elena's mind. How many more lay hidden here? Why had no one dug this far before? And more unsettling, what story did these remains tell? The air felt charged, and even the birds seemed to sense the tension. For a moment, the team collectively held its breath, aware that the excavation had crossed an invisible boundary. This was no ordinary archaeological dig. Something about the arrangement of the bones suggested intent, a pattern or purpose that was deliberate, haunting, and potentially horrifying. Locals had long avoided this place, and now the reason was becoming clear. This was more than history, it was a threshold between the present and a past so dark that it had been almost erased from memory. Every tree, every mound, seemed to whisper warnings. And yet, the pull of discovery, the promise of uncovering something never before seen, drove the archaeologists forward. They knew, instinctively, that what they were about to find could change everything they thought they understood about this region's history, and perhaps about humanity itself. Elena carefully marked the spot for further excavation, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The rest of the team followed her lead, their movements deliberate, almost reverent. There was a collective understanding that they were stepping into a narrative that had been left unfinished for centuries, one that would demand patience, courage, and a willingness to confront truths far darker than anticipated. And just as they prepared to dig deeper, a faint sound, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, brushed against the edge of the clearing. They paused. Nobody spoke. The forest seemed to close in around them, a reminder that some secrets, once disturbed, could never be put back into the ground. And with that, the first real piece of the forbidden site had been uncovered. The dig had begun. But the question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting: what exactly lay buried beneath their feet, and would they be ready to face it? The following morning, the forest seemed even quieter, as if it had been holding its breath overnight. The team returned to the clearing with renewed determination, their equipment rattling softly with each step. Tension hung thick in the air, no one spoke much, each lost in thought about the fragment of bone unearthed the day before. The dig had begun, and with it, the sense that they were stepping into a story that had been waiting centuries to be told. Every movement was careful, precise, deliberate. They knew that one misstep could disturb evidence forever, and perhaps even stir something they did not understand. Dr. Elena Reyes led the excavation, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt deep in her chest. The soil was dense, a mixture of clay and organic material, as if the earth itself had tried to swallow the secrets it held. Shovels pierced the ground with careful rhythm, brushes traced delicate lines over fragments, and scanners hummed quietly, detecting anomalies beneath the surface. Then came the moment that would change everything. A larger piece of skeletal remains emerged, a skull, partially buried, half hidden beneath layers of earth. The team froze again, the gravity of the discovery sinking in. It was human, ancient, and positioned with unmistakable intent. The skull had no signs of decay beyond what time itself would cause, but the placement was deliberate. Teeth clenched, eye sockets staring upward as if in silent warning, it told a story of violence, ritual, or perhaps punishment. Elena crouched beside it, careful not to disturb anything, tracing her gloved fingers along the jawline. Around it, smaller bones peeked out, ribs, fragments of limbs, and a few scattered vertebrae. The arrangement was unnatural, almost ceremonial. A sense of dread settled over the team. Something about the positioning suggested that these were not just victims of circumstance, but part of a pattern, a deliberate act frozen in time. A junior archaeologist, Mark, uncovered a small artifact nearby, a chipped piece of pottery, etched with symbols that no one could immediately identify. It was crude, yet purposeful, a stark reminder that whoever had buried these people had intended for their presence to be felt, even centuries later. Another team member discovered a rusted metallic object, long corroded but strangely intact, hinting at a sophistication in materials that contradicted the crude burial. Questions flew between the team, theories forming and dissolving like fog. Were these victims of ritualistic violence? A forgotten massacre? Or something even more sinister? As they worked, Elena noticed the soil around one skeleton appeared disturbed in a pattern inconsistent with natural decomposition. Carefully digging around the bones, the team uncovered what appeared to be more than a dozen bodies, some overlapping, others arranged with deliberate spacing. The sense of scale struck them. This was not a single event but multiple burials over time. And yet, there was a uniformity, a chilling consistency that suggested a conscious design. Each discovery intensified the feeling that the ground beneath them was hiding stories that were never meant to be uncovered. The team paused for a moment, scanning the surrounding area. The forest remained eerily silent, as if listening to their every move. Dr. Reyes felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. They were scientists, trained to analyze and understand, yet the emotional weight of the discovery pressed heavily upon them. Mark whispered under his breath about the unnatural quiet, and another archaeologist muttered about legends they had dismissed as superstition. But science offered no comfort here. The evidence spoke for itself, raw and undeniable, and it was frightening in its implications. Hours passed, and the excavation revealed more artifacts, fragments of clothing, remnants of rope or bindings, and more shards etched with symbols. Some bones bore unmistakable marks of trauma, blunt force, slicing instruments, and signs of post-mortem manipulation. Every discovery layered horror upon curiosity. This was no ordinary mass grave. Each artifact, each bone, was a piece of a puzzle, and the picture forming was darker than anyone had anticipated. Then came the moment of true shock. Elena uncovered a particularly well-preserved femur, lying next to an intricately carved amulet. The amulet bore a symbol that seemed vaguely familiar, yet its origins were obscure. The discovery suggested that this site might be connected to more than just local history, perhaps a long-forgotten cult, a political purge, or a hidden power structure that had once ruled with terror. The implications were staggering. The site was not simply historical, it was a portal into the darkest recesses of human behavior, a window into crimes that spanned generations. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the clearing. The team stepped back, exhausted, their hands trembling not from physical exertion but from the weight of what they had uncovered. Hundreds of fragments, dozens of bodies, and an array of artifacts hinted at a story centuries in the making, and yet only partially told. Elena's mind raced with questions. How far did this extend? Were there more remains beyond what they had uncovered? And most unsettling of all, what dangers might arise if they continued? As they prepared to leave the site for the night, a sudden rustling came from the forest's edge. Nothing visible emerged, yet the sound was enough to freeze the team in place. Was it an animal, or something else, a warning, as if the land itself was alive and aware of their intrusion? Nobody spoke, yet the unspoken thought lingered in the air: some secrets are not merely buried, they are protected. And with that, the day's discovery left the team staring at the clearing in a mixture of awe, fear, and dread, knowing that the true scope of what they had uncovered was only beginning to reveal itself. The site, though silent in the present, was steeped in whispers from centuries past. As the archaeologists continued their careful work, Dr. Elena Reyes couldn't shake the feeling that the soil itself was speaking, each layer of dirt a page in a story long abandoned. She had spent hours poring over local archives and dusty manuscripts before arriving here, but nothing could prepare her for the gravity of what lay beneath the forest floor. Every fragment of bone, every shard of pottery, every faded symbol suggested a connection to events that had been deliberately erased from history, or perhaps only whispered about in hushed tones. Local legends spoke of entire villages vanishing, of families disappearing overnight with no explanation. Old letters and chronicles hinted at a time when power was enforced with brutal efficiency, when disputes were settled not through law, but through fear and violence. There were mentions of a small ruling elite whose whims could dictate life and death, leaving behind a trail of sorrow and mystery. Some records were cryptic, referencing those who were taken, and the earth that swallowed them, phrases that now seemed to align unerringly with the excavation before them. The team began to piece together the human stories behind the remains. Through subtle forensic analysis and comparison with historical accounts, they could imagine the lives of some victims: a young woman clutching a small pendant, perhaps a cherished keepsake, a man whose hands bore the calluses of labor, suggesting he had worked the land only to meet a grim fate, children whose tiny bones hinted at a life cruelly cut short. Each skeleton was more than just evidence, it was a person, a life interrupted, and a story yearning to be acknowledged. Elena felt a pang of sorrow, an almost parental instinct to honor these forgotten souls. Her team, too, moved with reverence, understanding that they were walking through a cemetery of human tragedy, each step a dialogue with the past. But the history was not straightforward. Records conflicted, legends contradicted one another, and gaps stretched across decades. Some victims appeared to date back hundreds of years, while others were shockingly recent, as if the dark practices of the past had persisted in secret long after they were thought extinguished. Scholars among the team speculated about clandestine societies, rituals, or systemic violence that had been carried out quietly under the guise of everyday life. The deeper they dug, both literally and figuratively, the more it became apparent that they were uncovering a historical truth far more unsettling than anyone had anticipated. The forest, in its silence, seemed to carry the weight of memory. Birds hesitated to sing, wind whispered through the trees like a voice half heard, and the very air seemed heavy with stories of sorrow, fear, and survival. Every artifact the team uncovered added layers to the narrative: a worn amulet, a fragment of a ceremonial garment, a rusted blade. Together, these objects suggested not mere deaths but deliberate acts, possibly punitive, possibly ritualistic. And yet, who carried out these acts? Were they sanctioned by local leaders, driven by superstition, or fueled by cruelty unrecorded in official histories? The questions mounted, each answer only leading to more uncertainty. As Elena traced patterns among the remains, she noticed unsettling consistencies. Certain symbols recurred on artifacts, specific positioning of the bodies seemed methodical. These patterns indicated planning, purpose, perhaps even a message meant to survive time itself. It was a chilling reminder that while the victims' lives had been silenced, the perpetrators had ensured their presence was recorded in ways the living might not immediately understand. Every brushstroke of dirt revealed fragments of intention, a macabre design left for the world to eventually uncover. Amidst this haunting revelation, the team's thoughts returned to the human toll. There was an emotional resonance in imagining who these people were, how they lived, and how they had died. The researchers shared quiet stories, speculative reconstructions, even silent moments of reflection at the edge of the dig site. They were scientists, but they were also witnesses, carriers of memory. In honoring the dead, they felt a responsibility not just to document, but to understand, to translate tragedy into comprehension. And yet, the deeper the story unfolded, the more disturbing the implications became. The lives lost here were part of a larger narrative, one that had been deliberately obscured, and they were only scratching the surface. By mid-afternoon, the forest had taken on a hushed intensity. Shadows lengthened as the sun filtered through the canopy, illuminating the cleared ground with golden streaks that contrasted eerily with the dark soil. The team worked with an almost sacred focus, careful not to disrupt the fragile balance between uncovering history and respecting it. Elena stepped back to survey their progress, noticing the arrangement of bones, the concentration of artifacts, and the sheer scale of the site. Her mind raced with questions about the people who had lived, labored, and died here, and those who had orchestrated these burials with such deliberate intent. As the day drew to a close, one thought lingered more than any other: the past had not forgotten. The echoes were real, present in the earth, in the objects, and in the very silence of the forest. The team had begun to hear them, faintly but unmistakably, voices from centuries ago, stories of suffering, courage, and unresolved mysteries that demanded acknowledgement. And as they packed up their tools, leaving the dig for the night, Elena knew that each day forward would only pull them deeper into a narrative that refused to remain hidden. But just as they stepped back from the cleared earth, a faint, almost imperceptible movement caught Elena's eye. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Something stirred in the shadows of the trees, and for a moment, the boundary between the past and the present felt tenuous, fragile, and terrifying. The site had secrets yet to reveal, and some of those secrets were waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. By the fourth day of excavation, the team's unease had deepened into something tangible, almost physical. The forest seemed to lean in, its shadows stretching longer with every passing hour, its silence heavier than ever. Dr. Elena Reyes and her team had uncovered dozens of skeletons, each telling its own story, yet together forming a narrative that was far darker and more deliberate than anyone had anticipated. The scale of the site was enormous, and the arrangement of the bodies, fragments, and artifacts suggested a methodical purpose, a message or ritual encoded in the earth itself. The first pattern became clear when Mark, the youngest member of the team, unearthed a line of small bones arranged in a circle around a larger skeletal figure. The circle was imperfect but unmistakable, each fragment carefully placed as though following an ancient design. Elena crouched beside it, her gloved hands hovering just above the soil. She could feel the weight of intention. These were not accidental burials, not haphazard remains. Someone had gone to painstaking lengths to arrange these bodies, a chilling reminder that deliberate acts of violence were frozen in time. Nearby, another team member discovered a grouping of skeletal remains in a formation resembling a spiral. Each set of bones radiated outward, and at the center lay a small, blackened stone object, worn smooth by centuries of earth and weather. The object bore carvings that were difficult to interpret, shapes that hinted at symbols, but whose meaning was lost to history. The team whispered among themselves, a mix of awe and fear in their voices. Had they stumbled upon an ancient ritual site? A sacrificial ground? Or a more sinister, organized effort to mark and control death in a way no one could have imagined? Elena called the team together, scanning the various clusters of remains. Patterns repeated, circles, spirals, and arrangements that aligned with the positions of the sun at certain times of the year. Some skeletons had been positioned with arms outstretched or hands folded in ways that suggested prayer or supplication. Others were partially dismembered, with bones placed to highlight or symbolize something beyond comprehension. The sheer level of thought behind each arrangement made it clear, the people buried here had not merely been killed, they had been arranged to communicate something beyond death, a message encoded in their suffering. Forensic expert Dr. Lucas Patel examined the bones, his brow furrowed as he noted repeated trauma patterns. Many showed blunt force injuries to the skull or signs of binding, as if the victims had been restrained before death. Some bore markings on ribs and long bones that suggested the use of sharp instruments. These were not the haphazard casualties of war or accident. They were carefully, purposefully killed, and then deliberately arranged. Patel's voice was subdued, almost reverent. "This is beyond anything I've seen," he said. "Every act here, from the killing to the placement, was intentional. Whoever did this wanted their message to last centuries." The artifacts embedded among the bones reinforced the ritualistic theory. Small carved talismans, fragments of cloth with unusual dyes, and etched pottery suggested that the deceased had been part of ceremonies or offerings. Elena's eyes were drawn to a recurring motif, a symbol that appeared on several artifacts and at the base of some skeletal arrangements. Its meaning was unknown, but the repetition hinted at a belief system or code that the living had carefully embedded in these burials. Each discovery raised more questions than answers, layering the site with a complexity that defied easy explanation. The deeper the team dug, the more they noticed subtleties. Some skeletons were positioned to face one another, others seemed to be oriented toward a central point in the clearing. The soil around certain remains appeared intentionally compacted, as if to hold the bodies in precise alignment over centuries. Elena documented every detail, photographing, sketching, and marking each find. Every mark in the earth, every pattern in the placement, seemed to whisper a story of power, ritual, or punishment. And the more they uncovered, the more the forest's silence pressed down upon them, as if the land itself were aware of their intrusion. Tensions among the team rose subtly but noticeably. Fear mingled with fascination. Mark, normally cheerful, refused to enter certain parts of the dig, muttering about "eyes watching us." Another archaeologist, Anna, insisted on taking meticulous notes, her hands trembling as she traced the outline of a particularly intricate spiral of bones. Even Elena, grounded and composed, felt a chill creep into her chest. They were not simply excavating history, they were witnessing a language of death designed to last across time. The patterns were deliberate, sophisticated, and undeniably human, yet they carried an almost inhuman weight, as if the intentions behind them had been carefully calculated to shock and haunt any future observer. By late afternoon, the sun cast long, slanted shadows across the clearing. The team paused to survey their findings, the forest eerily still. Each pattern suggested intention, each arrangement hinted at a message, but the meaning remained frustratingly out of reach. They had uncovered part of a system, a language encoded in bone and artifact, and yet the full story eluded them. The forest seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if aware of how much had been revealed and how much remained hidden. Then came the first truly unsettling discovery of the day, a small mound slightly apart from the rest, partially obscured by roots and moss. Elena knelt to brush away the debris and froze. Beneath her fingers lay a skull, positioned perfectly upright, its hollow gaze staring straight at her. Around it were carefully arranged fragments, teeth, small bones, and shards of pottery, forming a pattern that mimicked the spiral and circle motifs seen elsewhere. But there was something new here, something intentionally disturbing, a human hand, placed palm up, its fingers spread as though reaching out from the earth. The team fell silent. Nobody spoke, yet the message was clear. The patterns were escalating, becoming more elaborate, more personal, and undeniably terrifying. The discovery forced Elena to step back and look at the site as a whole. Circles, spirals, upright skulls, outstretched hands, it was as if they were reading a language that conveyed authority, ritual, and terror simultaneously. Whoever had created this had planned for observers across centuries to uncover it, to witness the calculated horror and perhaps be unsettled by it. And as the wind whispered through the trees, Elena felt a cold realization settle over her. the site was far more than a historical curiosity. It was a monument to something deeply sinister, and the forest around them seemed to guard its secrets jealously. The patterns had revealed themselves, but they had also raised the stakes. The deeper they dug, the more complex and horrifying the arrangements became. And as the team packed up for the night, one unspoken question hovered in the air, heavy and persistent: if these patterns were deliberate, what was the ultimate purpose, and who had the power to orchestrate something so vast and terrifying? By the fifth day at the dig site, the team's rhythm had become both methodical and tense. Every morning, they approached the clearing with a mixture of excitement and dread, aware that each shovel of dirt could reveal more of the site's horrifying secrets. Yet something had shifted. The forest no longer felt passive. It had become a silent observer, watching the archaeologists as they uncovered the past. Leaves rustled when no wind stirred. Shadows lingered in corners where sunlight had never reached. And on more than one occasion, team members reported seeing fleeting movements at the forest's edge, glimpses of figures that vanished before they could be confirmed. Dr. Elena Reyes noticed it first. As she crouched over a partially unearthed skeleton, brushing dirt carefully from a fractured femur, she felt a prickling on the back of her neck, the sensation that someone, or something, was observing her. She looked up, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. When she mentioned it to her team, they laughed nervously, attributing it to fatigue and imagination. Yet even the skeptics admitted later that the feeling had been mutual: eyes were watching, a presence intangible but undeniable. Then came the first physical sign of interference. While the team had stepped away briefly to gather more tools, Elena returned to the excavation grid to find a small mound of freshly disturbed soil that she had not moved. At first, she assumed it was an accident, perhaps one of the younger assistants had tripped or shifted dirt. But closer inspection revealed something more troubling: footprints, too large to belong to any member of the team, circling the edge of the grid. They disappeared into the dense forest, as though whoever had made them had deliberately avoided detection. A hush fell over the team as they gathered to inspect the tracks. Mark, usually the most light-hearted member, turned pale. "We're not alone," he said quietly, almost to himself. Anna, taking detailed notes, whispered, "It's like someone doesn't want us here." The word "someone" hung heavy in the air, an unspoken fear that had been slowly building over the past days. The team realized they were no longer just uncovering history, they were being watched in the present. Attempts to rationalize the interference faltered quickly. Could it be local poachers, curious villagers, or trespassers drawn by rumors? Perhaps. But the forest's eerie silence and the timing of the disturbances suggested something more calculated. Elena felt the weight of responsibility not just for the archaeological record, but for the safety of her team. The excavation had crossed into territory that was clearly sensitive, and she couldn't ignore the possibility that the site's secrets were being protected, by people, or by forces she could not yet understand. As the day progressed, tension mounted further. Tools left carefully arranged in the morning were found displaced, camera equipment occasionally malfunctioned, and small markers indicating bone positions had been subtly shifted. Each incident fueled the team's growing paranoia. Conversations became hushed, movements cautious. Even when they laughed to lighten the mood, the laughter was strained, shadows of doubt lingering in their eyes. The forest's watchful presence seemed more pronounced than ever. Then came the most unsettling moment. While analyzing soil layers, Elena's assistant discovered something half buried at the perimeter of the dig, a crudely fashioned effigy, made from twigs and fragments of cloth, impaled on a small stake and partially charred. It was clearly intended as a warning, though its exact meaning was opaque. The object's presence transformed abstract fear into something concrete: someone, or some group, was aware of their activity and actively trying to intimidate them. The team gathered around the effigy, exchanging nervous glances. Dr. Lucas Patel, normally analytical and composed, muttered, "This isn't a coincidence. They're telling us to stop." Elena traced her fingers along the scorched cloth. There was no direct threat written, no overt message, yet the symbolism was unmistakable: the site is not yours to uncover. Every instinct screamed at them to be cautious, yet the pull of discovery was stronger than the instinct to retreat. Adding to the anxiety, local villagers who had at first appeared indifferent began to act strangely. Some avoided the site entirely, while others lingered at a distance, watching silently. Attempts to question them yielded little, nervous smiles, vague answers, and hurried departures. One elderly man muttered, "The forest remembers. Leave it alone," before disappearing into the trees. The team realized that the history they were unearthing was intertwined with living memory, and that the past and present were colliding in ways they could not yet comprehend. By late afternoon, the forest had transformed into a labyrinth of tension. Shadows lengthened, twisting and stretching across the clearing, and the slightest sounds, a snapping twig, a falling leaf, were amplified in the team's collective imagination. Every noise became a potential threat. Elena called a brief meeting, emphasizing safety protocols and vigilance, but her own voice trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain authoritative. The balance between scientific curiosity and self-preservation had never felt so fragile. And then, the incident that would escalate paranoia to fear, Mark disappeared for several minutes while documenting a row of skulls. The team's calls echoed through the clearing with no answer. Hearts raced as they searched, panic rising with each passing second. Finally, he emerged from the shadows near the tree line, pale and silent. When questioned, he stammered about hearing whispering voices, distant chanting carried on the wind, and glimpses of figures moving among the trees. His account was almost impossible to verify, yet the terror in his eyes was undeniable. The team now faced a stark realization: they were not alone, and the forest, along with whatever forces, human or otherwise, protected it, was watching their every move. The excavation was no longer a controlled scientific endeavor. It had become a high-stakes operation, fraught with unseen eyes, subtle threats, and an invisible presence determined to guard the site's secrets. The bones and artifacts were no longer merely historical, they had become symbols of something far more immediate, powerful, and dangerous. As night began to fall, the team packed up their tools, moving quickly yet cautiously through the clearing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, shadows shifting in the dying light. Elena paused one last time, scanning the tree line. A flicker of movement, too swift to identify, vanished into darkness. The unspoken truth was clear: the past was not alone here. The present, too, had agents, watchers, and protectors. The team left the clearing, minds racing, hearts pounding, and questions multiplying. Whoever, or whatever, was watching them had made its presence known. And as they descended the narrow path back to their base camp, a single, chilling thought dominated Elena's mind: if they continued digging, the watchers might not remain passive much longer. The site had revealed its first warning. And now, the tension was no longer academic, it was personal. The next morning, the team returned to the clearing with a sense of trepidation. The previous day's incidents, the footprints, the effigy, Mark's brief disappearance, had left an indelible mark on everyone. Yet, beneath that fear was a relentless drive: the soil held secrets, and they could not walk away. Dr. Elena Reyes stood at the edge of the dig site, gloved hands resting on her hips, staring down at the disturbed earth. Each mound, each partially uncovered skeleton, seemed to pulse with history. The forest, silent yet watchful, pressed in around them, reminding them that discovery always carried a cost. Their first task was to document the site in exhaustive detail. Every skeleton, fragment, and artifact was measured, photographed, and logged. But it was forensic analysis that promised to reveal the most chilling truths. Dr. Lucas Patel, specializing in trauma and osteology, began to examine bones already uncovered. His tools traced fractures, marks, and discolorations that told stories far beyond mere age. He discovered, repeatedly, signs of deliberate trauma: skulls with clear blunt force injuries, ribs fractured in precise ways, and even cuts along long bones suggesting bindings or ceremonial mutilation. Each discovery reinforced the terrifying reality: these were not accidental deaths, nor casualties of natural disaster. They were deliberate, systematic, and, above all, brutal. DNA samples were taken, carefully preserved for later analysis. The team hoped to identify familial links among the remains, to discern patterns that might suggest organized groups of victims, or even repeated acts across generations. Preliminary results suggested startling connections. Some skeletons, although centuries old, bore genetic markers that aligned with populations still residing in the area today. This indicated a continuity of presence, perhaps even complicity, spanning centuries. The implications were unnerving. These deaths were not isolated. They were part of an ongoing historical narrative, one that had persisted quietly, hidden beneath layers of soil and silence. The discovery of artifacts alongside the bones added layers of mystery. Carved amulets, small talismans, and fragments of pottery displayed symbols repeated across decades. Some had been buried with offerings, seeds, small jewelry, even ceremonial pigments. Elena noted that certain items had been deliberately positioned near particular skeletal regions, as if to honor, punish, or mark the deceased. Dr. Patel's analysis suggested that some bones had been moved post-mortem, their placement intentional, hinting at ritualistic behavior designed to communicate messages to the living, or to the divine. Amidst these forensic revelations, the team uncovered evidence that challenged their understanding of chronology. While many remains were centuries old, others appeared startlingly recent. Modern clothing fibers, slight discolorations in bone indicative of more recent burial, and a few small personal effects suggested that this site had been used as a dumping ground well into the 20th century. The implications were horrifying. The past and present were intertwined here. Whatever dark practices had begun long ago had not entirely ceased, and the possibility that contemporary crimes were hidden among historical ones became terrifyingly real. The team also found bones arranged in ways that suggested hierarchical significance. Larger skeletons, perhaps representing adults, were positioned centrally, while smaller skeletons or fragments, possibly children or subordinates, circled them. This, combined with recurring symbols on nearby artifacts, suggested an organized system of burial designed to encode status, ritual, or warning. Elena realized that they were not merely uncovering bodies, they were reading a language of death, carefully constructed and deliberately preserved over centuries. While the scientific discoveries were profound, the psychological impact on the team was palpable. Fear and fascination intermingled in equal measure. Each new skeleton deepened the gravity of their work. Even the most stoic members admitted to sleepless nights, haunted by visions of the past lives and violent ends they were slowly reconstructing. The forest seemed to respond, wind whispering through the treetops, shadows shifting unnaturally, a constant reminder that the team was being watched, not only by modern eyes but by the echoes of the deceased themselves. As they carefully excavated a particularly dense cluster, Elena uncovered a skull that had been buried face down, its jaw slightly ajar. Near it lay a rusted metallic object, a small pendant etched with symbols that bore resemblance to artifacts found earlier. The combination of positioning, trauma, and associated objects suggested something profound. This was not a simple act of killing. It was ceremony, punishment, and communication simultaneously. Patel examined the mandible, noting microfractures along the teeth that hinted at stress and violence immediately before death. They wanted this remembered, he whispered, almost reverently. They wanted it to leave an impression for generations. The more the team dug, the clearer it became that the mass grave represented an organized effort spanning centuries. There were repeating patterns in burial placement, trauma type, and artifact inclusion. Some sections of the site aligned with celestial positions, possibly marking solstices or equinoxes. Others corresponded to natural landmarks, small hills, or water sources. The deliberate precision suggested intelligence, planning, and ritual sophistication that contradicted assumptions about local practices of the time. Elena could not shake the growing sense that they were piecing together a puzzle that was never meant to be solved. Yet the most shocking revelation came unexpectedly. A partially buried ledger, hidden in a small cavity lined with clay, contained faded inscriptions. Though difficult to decipher, preliminary translation suggested records of victims, names, dates, and sometimes causes of death. The ledger spanned centuries, hinting that the site had been in continuous use by an organized group. If verified, this could rewrite local history, revealing a network of power, secrecy, and systematic violence that persisted far longer than anyone had imagined. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the clearing, the team paused to reflect on the day's discoveries. Hundreds of victims, countless artifacts, and a ledger detailing centuries of killings, the scale of the site was overwhelming. Elena felt a chill. They were unearthing not just history, but evidence of a deliberate, ongoing human pattern of cruelty, secrecy, and ritual. The line between past and present blurred, and the stakes for uncovering the truth became unmistakably high. And yet, amidst the scientific breakthroughs and mounting horror, the forest whispered warnings. Rustling branches, distant cracks of wood, the occasional snapping of a twig, each sound reminded the team that their intrusion was noticed, that some secrets were guarded not only by time but by living witnesses. As night fell, Elena knew that what they had uncovered in the soil was only the beginning. The secrets of this site were vast, layered, and dangerous. And the deeper they dug, the closer they drew to truths that could unsettle even the most steadfast minds. In the quiet of the clearing, surrounded by shadows and whispers, the team realized the chilling reality: the soil had spoken, and it had secrets that were alive in memory, in pattern, and in warning. And the most unsettling thought remained, echoing through Elena's mind: if this grave had been used across centuries, who, or what, was still protecting its darkest secrets? By the seventh day, the excavation had become both a source of scientific wonder and a crucible of fear. The team had uncovered hundreds of human remains, intricate ritualistic patterns, and artifacts hinting at centuries of deliberate, organized killings. Yet their discoveries had not gone unnoticed. As Elena and her team meticulously documented the latest finds, a black SUV appeared on the narrow dirt road leading to the clearing. Its sudden presence felt jarring against the forest's silent, almost sacred backdrop. The vehicle stopped a few meters away, dust curling around its wheels, and two men in suits stepped out, their expressions unreadable. Dr. Elena Reyes instinctively felt tension coil in her chest. They were not expecting visitors. The men introduced themselves as representatives of the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, claiming to be overseeing sensitive historical sites. Their tone was polite but firm, and their eyes held an unspoken warning. One glanced at the carefully uncovered skeletons, then back at Elena. "This site is under observation," he said, voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Excavation must be limited until our assessment is complete." The team exchanged glances. They were scientists, trained to follow protocols, yet instinctively suspicious. Why had no formal notice been given in advance? Why now, at the peak of their discoveries, did these officials appear? Elena, keeping her voice measured, asked for clarification. The men offered none. They referenced historical sensitivities and ongoing investigations, phrases that did little to reassure anyone. Instead, the ambiguity heightened the sense of threat. The team was being warned, subtly but unmistakably, that continuing the dig carried consequences beyond scientific concern. Adding to the unease, the forest seemed to respond. Leaves rustled unusually, shadows appeared to shift in unnatural patterns, and distant sounds, snaps, whispers, the hint of movement, echoed around the clearing. Team members who had been anxious for days now felt paranoia solidify into a tangible fear. Even the most skeptical, hardened scientists sensed that they were intruding not only on history but on forces, human or otherwise, that did not wish to be disturbed. Over the next hours, the officials observed in silence, taking notes and photographs, occasionally questioning the team about excavation techniques and the locations of key finds. Their presence, while not overtly hostile, was suffocating. The subtext was clear: stop digging, or face consequences. Mark, visibly shaken from prior encounters with shadowy movements at the forest's edge, whispered to Anna, "It's not just about history anymore. They know we're seeing something we shouldn't." Anna nodded, gripping her clipboard tightly, noting every detail, her normally methodical demeanor now tinged with fear. The officials left as abruptly as they had arrived, promising a follow-up inspection and hinting at potential legal implications for unauthorized excavation. As their SUV disappeared down the dirt road, the forest seemed to exhale, but the tension did not dissipate. Elena gathered her team, trying to maintain calm. "We are scientists," she reminded them. "Our work is to uncover the past. But we must respect the boundaries set before us, and remain vigilant." The words were meant to reassure, yet even she felt the cold weight of warning pressing in. That evening, as the team reviewed photographs and notes, another unsettling detail emerged. Several of the artifacts, carefully catalogued earlier, had been subtly altered. Pieces that had been positioned perfectly were now slightly shifted. Small fragments of soil had been disturbed in ways consistent with human intervention. The realization sent a shiver through the group. Someone had returned to the site after the officials left. Their presence, clandestine and deliberate, suggested they were being monitored, or even manipulated, from multiple angles. Elena began to question the ethics of continuing the excavation. On one hand, the historical and scientific significance of the site was unparalleled. On the other, human and potentially supernatural threats were real and growing. Should they continue digging, fully aware of the dangers, or halt their work, leaving centuries of hidden history undisturbed? The debate rippled through the team. Some argued that uncovering the truth was paramount, that fear should never dictate science. Others, including Mark, were adamant that personal safety and the team's well-being must take precedence. As the night deepened, anxiety coalesced into something heavier. The forest's shadows seemed longer, the wind's whispers more deliberate. Elena could almost hear the echo of ancient voices, a chorus of past victims warning of boundaries not to be crossed. She couldn't dismiss the feeling that the warnings, both human and spectral, were intertwined. The dig site had become a nexus of past and present, of science and secrecy, of curiosity and caution. In the hours before dawn, a subtle but unmistakable sign cemented their fear. A message, crudely scratched into the dirt at the edge of the clearing, was discovered by Anna as she performed her nightly inspection. It was brief, direct, and chilling: "Leave now." No signature, no explanation, simply an imperative that seemed to resonate with the forest itself. The team gathered around the mark, hearts pounding, silence enveloping them. The weight of centuries of secrecy pressed in, unyielding, and the forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Elena faced a dilemma that would test both her resolve and leadership. They had uncovered patterns, artifacts, and remains that could redefine local history, possibly revealing crimes long covered up. Yet the repeated warnings, footprints, effigies, the official's visit, the altered artifacts, and now the explicit message, suggested active resistance to their work. She realized that their actions were being observed, their every move scrutinized, and their pursuit of truth was increasingly entangled with danger. The ethical and personal stakes were no longer abstract. If they continued, they might provoke retaliation, legal, social, or even physical. And yet, stepping away would mean leaving centuries of injustice unexamined, victims unnamed and forgotten. The tension was palpable, every team member felt it in the air, in the forest, and in the weight of the soil they had turned. The site itself seemed alive with memory, its message clear: history demanded acknowledgement, but at what cost? In the quiet moments before sleep, Elena reviewed the ledger they had discovered in Section 6, tracing names, dates, and patterns. Each line was a testament to lives lost, to power wielded cruelly and systematically. She realized that the warnings were not just about stopping them, they were about preserving secrecy, maintaining control over knowledge that had long been hidden. The realization was sobering: their excavation was no longer a purely academic endeavor. It had become a confrontation with forces determined to remain in control of the past. And yet, beneath the fear, a stubborn resolve lingered. Elena understood that history, no matter how dangerous, deserved to be uncovered, documented, and remembered. She steeled herself for what lay ahead. The forest, the watchers, and the echoes of centuries of secrecy would not relinquish their hold easily. But the truth demanded pursuit, even at great personal risk. As the team prepared for another day, Elena glanced at the edge of the clearing, the shadows lengthening in the early morning light. Somewhere beyond the trees, eyes watched, silent and unblinking. A warning had been given, and it was clear that the watchers would not remain passive for long. The question now loomed over them all: how far were they willing to go to uncover secrets deliberately buried, and fiercely protected, for generations? The warning had been issued. And it was not a threat that could be ignored. The morning sun had barely pierced the dense canopy when Dr. Elena Reyes returned to the clearing, her mind consumed by the ledger they had uncovered in Section 6. Carefully encased in a protective sleeve, the fragile document was unlike anything they had seen before. Its pages were yellowed with age, brittle at the edges, and filled with faded inscriptions that seemed to pulse with history. Every line, every name, hinted at stories untold, lives erased, and secrets deliberately buried with the soil. The team gathered around a portable table, setting up magnifying glasses, cameras, and forensic tools to document the ledger in detail. Dr. Lucas Patel, normally focused on bones and trauma, now assisted with ink analysis, noting the unusual composition of the writing. It was a mixture of charcoal and iron-based pigments, suggesting a time when conventional ink was scarce, but also deliberate in its preservation. Each mark had been made with care, as if the creator intended for these records to survive through centuries, waiting for discovery. Elena began deciphering the entries. Each line contained a name, an age, and occasionally a short notation, sometimes a date, sometimes a symbol, sometimes a cryptic phrase. The handwriting varied slightly, indicating that multiple people may have contributed to the ledger over time. Some entries were meticulous and detailed, while others were rough, almost hurried, but all conveyed the same chilling information: these were records of death, carefully catalogued. The team quickly realized the ledger was more than a simple record, it was a map to understanding the mass grave's purpose. Patterns emerged, certain families were repeatedly mentioned, dates clustered around specific times of year, and symbols reappeared consistently beside certain names. Elena's fingers traced the markings, her pulse quickening as she pieced together connections. The site was not merely a burial ground, it was a chronicle of generations, a systematic record of violence executed over centuries, maintained by an organization whose intentions were shrouded in mystery. One particularly unsettling section contained entries marked with a small spiral symbol, resembling those found etched into the bones and artifacts. These entries corresponded with the most elaborately arranged skeletons, suggesting that the ledger was directly linked to the patterns in the soil. Elena realized the implications: whoever created the ledger had designed it not merely to record deaths, but to document ritualistic arrangements, encoding hierarchy, purpose, and perhaps even moral or spiritual significance. Dr. Patel's analysis of the pigments revealed another layer of intrigue. Chemical traces suggested that some entries were added much later than the original inscriptions, possibly decades or even centuries afterward. The ledger had been actively maintained over generations, a living document chronicling continued practices. The realization sent shivers through the team: the mass grave might not be solely historical. Portions of it could contain victims from more recent times, blending centuries of ritual with ongoing concealment of crimes. As they continued decoding, the ledger revealed startling names. Some matched historical records of local families, while others were absent from any known documentation. Elena noted discrepancies: a family listed in the ledger appeared to have vanished entirely, their existence erased from public memory. The pattern suggested deliberate erasure: social, historical, and physical. These were not mere burials, they were instruments of control, ensuring that certain stories, lives, and tragedies remained hidden from the world. The emotional weight of the ledger pressed on the team. Mark, normally enthusiastic about discovery, sat silently, tracing names with trembling fingers. "They wanted us to find this," he whispered. "But not this far. They didn't want all of it revealed." His comment resonated with an unspoken truth: the ledger was not just history, it was a warning. Each page was a record, yes, but also a reminder that the knowledge it contained came with consequences. Anna, examining a particularly faded section, noticed symbols that appeared in combinations previously unseen at the site. They resembled the patterns in the spiral and circular bone arrangements, but with subtle variations that hinted at a hierarchy of significance. Some symbols were paired with single names, others with groups, suggesting levels of importance, status, or ritual function. The ledger was a guide to understanding the architecture of death, and decoding it could reveal the motives, methods, and perhaps even the identities of those responsible for centuries of killings. The team's discussion grew heated as they debated whether to continue deciphering. The ledger held unprecedented historical value, yet its contents suggested a continuing threat. They were confronting an organization, or perhaps a tradition, that had preserved its secrets meticulously. The implications extended beyond academia, they touched on moral, legal, and potentially personal danger. Every argument to proceed was met with equal argument for caution. Elena, standing at the center, understood the gravity of the choice. To stop meant leaving centuries of truth buried, to continue meant challenging forces determined to protect it. Hours passed, the forest outside growing quiet under the weight of history. The team worked meticulously, each member focused yet tense, aware that any misstep could have consequences. They deciphered names, dates, and symbols, gradually revealing a complex tapestry of ritualized violence, societal control, and intergenerational patterns of secrecy. The ledger confirmed suspicions: the site had been active for centuries, carefully maintained, and deliberately hidden. Its purpose was multifaceted: to bury, to record, to ritualize, and to warn. As the day drew to a close, Elena traced a final set of entries. The names were accompanied by symbols they had not yet seen on artifacts or bones, suggesting a final layer of secrecy, one that had been preserved with extreme care. The forest seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, as if the land itself recognized the significance of their discovery. The ledger was not complete, yet what they had uncovered was enough to suggest that the mass grave was part of a larger system, a continuum of control, death, and ritual that extended beyond the site itself. Elena closed the ledger carefully, her mind racing. The discoveries had revealed far more than she had anticipated: centuries of violence, systemic concealment, ritualistic patterns, and a ledger that chronicled both past and potentially recent victims. The forest outside seemed alive with memory, and the shadows among the trees whispered of watchers still present. The ledger had unlocked a narrative that was both historical and immediate, forcing the team to confront truths they could barely process. The final realization settled in Elena's mind like a stone: the ledger was more than a document. It was a key to understanding the site's dark purpose, a guide to the intentions behind centuries of death, and a warning of forces, human, cultural, and possibly supernatural, determined to preserve these secrets. And as she gazed out across the clearing, the wind whispering through the trees, one thought dominated her: the secrets contained in the ledger were far from safe. Those who had protected this knowledge for centuries were still watching, waiting for the right moment to act. The team left the clearing for the night, hearts heavy with the weight of their discoveries. The ledger had spoken, revealing truths long hidden beneath layers of soil and silence. But it had also whispered warnings, subtle yet unmistakable: the past was not merely being uncovered, it was defending itself. And as shadows lengthened across the forest floor, Elena knew the next day would bring revelations, challenges, and dangers that could change everything they thought they knew about history, secrecy, and the human capacity for violence. The morning air was thick with tension as the team returned to the clearing. The ledger, carefully preserved overnight, rested on a makeshift table, its pages worn but potent with revelations. Elena had spent hours reviewing the entries, noting connections between names, symbols, and dates. Today, the mission was clear: cross-reference the ledger with the skeletal patterns uncovered in sections 4 and 6, to see if the carefully recorded histories aligned with the physical arrangements in the soil. The team began by examining the circular and spiral patterns that had drawn their attention earlier. Elena, crouched beside a particularly complex spiral, compared notes from the ledger. A name, accompanied by the spiral symbol, matched a skeleton at the center of the arrangement. The careful alignment of bones, the positioning of outstretched arms, and the nearby artifacts corresponded perfectly with the ledger's cryptic entries. The realization hit them with chilling clarity: the past had been meticulously orchestrated and documented, as if the dead themselves had been organized to tell a story centuries in the making. As they continued mapping ledger entries to skeletal formations, patterns emerged that were both fascinating and horrifying. Certain families were repeatedly marked with spirals, circles, and other symbols indicating hierarchy or ritual significance. Children, identified by smaller skeletal remains, were consistently positioned around central figures, suggesting not just burial but a deliberate statement about lineage, status, and possibly punishment. Every detail in the soil now had context, and every entry in the ledger took on new significance. They were witnessing a language of death, a system of communication encoded across generations. Dr. Lucas Patel focused on trauma analysis, uncovering patterns that linked specific injuries to symbols in the ledger. Skulls marked with fractures corresponded to entries denoting individuals who had been bound or offered according to the symbol's interpretation. Ribs showing signs of deliberate crushing aligned with names accompanied by spirals, confirming that the ledger did more than record deaths. It encoded methods of execution and ceremonial procedures. The team was piecing together not only history but ritualized atrocity, revealing a level of sophistication and planning that sent shivers down their spines. Artifacts unearthed alongside the remains reinforced the connection between ledger entries and physical arrangements. Talismans, pottery shards, and carved symbols were found precisely where the ledger suggested they should be, often correlating with specific rituals or times of year. Elena noted that some objects seemed deliberately chosen to amplify messages: a rusted pendant placed on a child's rib cage, a carved amulet aligned with an adult's skull, fragments of ceremonial dyes sprinkled across the soil. Each arrangement was intentional, calculated to convey meaning long after the perpetrators had died or vanished. The team's excitement was tempered by unease. Mapping ledger entries to skeletal arrangements revealed not just historical practices but ongoing implications. Some patterns suggested recent burials, blending centuries-old methods with contemporary secrecy. The ledger hinted that the site might still be used for ritualistic purposes, or at the very least that the knowledge of these practices had persisted into modern times. This revelation forced the team to confront the possibility that they were not simply historians, they were intruding on living secrets with potential consequences. Amidst the analysis, the forest itself seemed to press closer. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, leaves rustled without wind, and distant movements hinted at unseen observers. Mark, visibly shaken, kept glancing toward the tree line, whispering about figures moving just beyond sight. Anna, documenting every pattern, admitted that she felt the weight of countless eyes upon them, a mixture of human watchfulness and something older, more enduring. The forest had become a participant in their investigation, an ever-present witness to the truths being revealed. The most harrowing discovery came when the team uncovered a cluster of skeletons arranged in an interlocking pattern, circles within spirals, forming a labyrinthine design. The ledger indicated that these individuals had been part of a single ritual, executed over a short span of time, their deaths meticulously coordinated. Some skeletons bore signs of extreme trauma, others were remarkably intact, as if selected for symbolic preservation. Objects found among the remains: a small dagger, fragments of dyed cloth, and a carved talisman, aligned with ledger entries, confirming the ritualistic intent. Elena and Patel exchanged grim looks. The ledger had not only chronicled deaths but dictated how they should occur, leaving a tangible imprint on the earth that endured centuries. The emotional toll on the team was immense. Each skeleton was a story, each ledger entry a voice from the past. The realization that these people had been catalogued, manipulated, and arranged intentionally for posterity was chilling. Mark, unable to contain his anxiety, whispered, "They wanted us to see this, to understand it. But not all of it." His words echoed in the clearing, a reminder that some secrets were meant to unsettle even the most disciplined minds. Patterns in the ledger also revealed a hierarchy among the deceased. Certain symbols denoted high-status individuals, while others marked those of lower rank. Placement in the soil mirrored this hierarchy. Central figures were flanked by subordinates, some arranged in protective circles, others in positions of vulnerability. The meticulousness was staggering. It was as if the creators of the grave were not only preserving memory but asserting control over life and death itself, projecting power that extended far beyond the immediate victims. As the day waned, Elena gathered the team to review their findings. They had connected dozens of ledger entries to skeletal arrangements, uncovering a narrative of ritualized violence and deliberate documentation spanning centuries. Yet the more they revealed, the more questions arose. Who had maintained the ledger across generations? How had such practices persisted undisturbed? And perhaps most pressing, were these dark rituals truly a thing of the past, or was someone still watching, still preserving the secrets encoded in both ledger and soil? The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest seemed to hum with awareness, as though acknowledging their discoveries. Every name matched a skeleton, every symbol correlated with a pattern, yet the full story remained elusive. The ledger had guided them to an understanding, but it had also revealed the vastness of what remained hidden. For every connection made, more mysteries emerged, layering fear, fascination, and urgency. As the team packed up for the night, Elena felt a chill settle over her. They had unveiled the past, but in doing so, they had awakened it. The ledger had acted as a bridge, connecting centuries of ritual, secrecy, and violence to the present moment. And as shadows lengthened across the forest floor, she realized that the mass grave was not merely a historical site, it was a warning, a message, and perhaps a challenge. The forest was no longer just a backdrop to their work. It was alive with memory, watchful and patient, holding its secrets close yet revealing them piece by piece. The ledger had unveiled the past, but the question remained, how far would the watchers allow the truth to emerge, and what would be the cost of uncovering it fully? By the 10th day, the excavation site had transformed from a simple clearing into a stage where history, ritual, and human curiosity collided. The ledger had revealed centuries of meticulous record-keeping, the skeletal arrangements had exposed deliberate hierarchies and ritualized violence, and the forest itself seemed alive with silent, watchful presence. Every step through the soil was a negotiation with the past, a fragile truce with the countless lives that had been buried, catalogued, and in some ways, commanded from beyond the grave. Elena led the team to a section of the site that had remained untouched until now, a low mound partially hidden beneath thick undergrowth. She had noticed subtle markings in the ledger suggesting this area contained the most significant remains, possibly central figures in the mass graves hierarchy. As they cleared the overgrowth, they uncovered a series of skeletons arranged in a symmetrical pattern unlike anything previously found. The central skeleton, larger than the others and positioned with its arms outstretched, seemed almost ceremonial, as if it had been intended to dominate the entire site even in death. Dr. Patel examined the central skeleton, noting the extreme trauma carefully inflicted on the skull and ribcage. The wounds were consistent with ritualistic execution rather than combat or punishment. Small artifacts, including a carved amulet and fragments of dyed cloth, had been positioned with precise intention, emphasizing the significance of this individual. Elena traced her fingers along the soil, realizing that the placement echoed celestial alignments mentioned in the ledger, solstices, equinoxes, and the paths of distant stars. The forest, ancient and silent, seemed to acknowledge the importance of this discovery. The deeper they dug, the more they understood the scale and sophistication of the site. The central figure was surrounded by concentric circles of smaller skeletons, each cluster marked with symbols matching entries in the ledger. Children, adults, and elders alike had been arranged deliberately, creating a narrative of hierarchy, ritual, and control that spanned generations. Every discovery reinforced the uncomfortable truth: these burials were carefully orchestrated communications across time, intended to convey power, warning, and memory. Yet amidst the exhilaration of discovery came unease. Shadows flitted at the edges of vision, whispers carried on the wind, and subtle signs of modern interference reminded them that unseen eyes were still observing. Mark, who had long been on edge, stumbled over a root and nearly dropped a cluster of bones. The forest seemed almost to react, rustling violently in a sudden gust of wind. Elena felt the familiar prickling on her neck, the sensation that they were being watched by forces beyond comprehension. The watchers of the site were patient, and now their presence was unmistakable. The ledger offered one final revelation. A hidden section, previously overlooked, contained entries that connected the oldest burials to surprisingly recent deaths. The symbols indicated continuity, a preservation of ritual that might have extended into living memory. The implication was chilling. The mass grave was not just a historical record, it might have been an active site well into the modern era. The team faced an ethical and existential dilemma. They had uncovered knowledge that could challenge history, law, and morality, but they were also intruding on a tradition still fiercely protected. Elena paused, weighing the consequences. The temptation to continue, to uncover every detail and expose the full story, was almost irresistible. Yet the repeated warnings, the effigy, the black SUV, the scratched message, the subtle alterations in artifacts, were undeniable. They were not simply archaeologists, they had become participants in a centuries-old continuum of secrecy, observation, and judgment. The forest had issued its warnings, and now it seemed poised to evaluate their intentions. As the sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing, a sudden movement at the tree-line froze the team. Figures, indistinct but clearly human, observed from a distance. They remained silent, enigmatic, their presence almost ceremonial. Elena recognized the implication immediately. The watchers were present, guardians of history and ritual, and they were assessing whether the team's intrusion was respectful or reckless. The forest, the watchers, and the buried dead were all in silent judgment. The team worked with renewed care, documenting the final skeletal clusters, cataloging every artifact, and photographing the alignment of the graves in relation to the ledger's entries. Every action was deliberate, almost reverential. They realized that this was not just excavation, it was negotiation with the past, a delicate balance between uncovering truth and provoking forces that had preserved this grave across centuries. In the dying light, Elena uncovered one final artifact, a small, intricately carved box buried beneath the central skeleton. Inside were fragments of parchment and tiny ceremonial objects that mirrored symbols found throughout the site. Patel examined the contents, noting the care with which they had been preserved. The box was a key, a repository of knowledge designed to survive time and observation. It was as if the creators of the grave had anticipated discovery, leaving behind a controlled revelation for those who proved diligent, respectful, and patient. But the forest did not relinquish its secrets easily. As night fell completely, the wind carried an eerie whisper, almost like voices speaking in unison, and shadows deepened around the perimeter of the clearing. The team felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the unspoken presence of watchers judging each movement. Elena's heart raced, the boundaries between past and present had blurred. The site was no longer simply archaeological, it was living history, a continuum of ritual, secrecy, and moral evaluation. In that moment, Elena understood the gravity of their work. They had unveiled the past in full, uncovered the ledger, interpreted the skeletal hierarchies, and documented artifacts that revealed centuries of ritualistic violence. Yet the forest's judgment remained unresolved. The watchers, human or otherwise, had witnessed every discovery, every movement, and every decision. Their intentions were unknowable, but their vigilance was undeniable. The excavation had reached its climax, but the consequences, moral, historical, and possibly personal, would extend far beyond the clearing. The team packed up cautiously, moving in silence as they left the site. The forest seemed to breathe around them, acknowledging their discoveries while issuing a silent warning: history could be revealed, but respect and caution were paramount. Every name, every symbol, every carefully arranged skeleton had a story, and those stories were intertwined with forces both human and eternal. As they descended the narrow path back to base camp, Elena cast one last glance at the clearing. The central skeleton, the hidden box, and the patterns in the soil all remained in their carefully preserved positions. The watchers had made their judgment clear: they had observed, they had tested, and they had allowed the team to leave. But the message lingered: the past is never fully ours to uncover without consequence, and the forest, like history itself, never forgets. The night swallowed the clearing, leaving only whispers, shadows, and the enduring weight of centuries. Elena understood that the excavation had revealed truths long buried, yet the full story of the mass grave, and the forces that protected it, remained only partially known. The forest's judgment had been passed, but its lessons would resonate forever. The night had settled over the forest like a velvet shroud, dense and silent, yet alive with the memories of centuries. The excavation site, now partially covered and meticulously documented, seemed almost sacred, a monument to lives long erased from public memory. Elena stood at the edge of the clearing, the ledger in her hands, the hidden box carefully secured. The discoveries of the past weeks weighed heavily on her, not only the forensic and historical revelations but the emotional toll of bearing witness to untold tragedy. The forest was quiet, yet the air carried a sense of presence, as if the countless individuals buried within its soil were observing from beyond the veil of mortality. Elena could almost hear whispers, echoes of laughter, cries, and the muffled sound of footsteps from centuries ago. Every name in the ledger had a story, every skeleton represented a life, and together, they formed a chorus of the forgotten, voices silenced but now being acknowledged. The realization was profound: the excavation had not merely uncovered bones, it had illuminated humanity's capacity for cruelty, resilience, and remembrance. As she walked among the carefully preserved skeletal patterns one final time, Elena reflected on the scale of the mass grave. Hundreds of victims, arranged with deliberate care and documented meticulously, represented generations of ritualistic violence. The ledger, with its cryptic symbols, dates, and names, had acted as a bridge across time, connecting the present with acts committed centuries ago. Yet the story was more than history, it was a testament to enduring secrecy, human obsession with power, and the lengths to which people would go to preserve knowledge and fear. Mark, Anna, and Patel joined her, each carrying the same mixture of awe and unease. They had witnessed extraordinary archaeological work, uncovered historical atrocities, and confronted warnings, both human and supernatural, that left them shaken. Yet the emotional resonance went deeper: every skeleton was a person, every ledger entry a voice demanding acknowledgement. The team shared a moment of solemn reflection, understanding that their work had given these forgotten lives recognition, even if only partially. The hidden box, previously revealed in Section 10, now took on greater significance. Its contents, parchments, ceremonial objects, and fragments of pigments, represented deliberate attempts to communicate across centuries. Elena examined each piece carefully. The parchments contained symbols that mirrored those in the ledger, suggesting layered meanings, perhaps instructions for the living or messages for posterity. The artifacts were imbued with intentionality, chosen for their symbolism, and positioned to survive the passage of time. It was as if the creators of the mass grave had anticipated discovery, leaving clues to guide those who sought understanding, but only if approached with respect and care. As the team carefully catalogued the final pieces, subtle signs reminded them that they were not alone. A rustle in the trees, a distant snap of a branch, and the faint impression of footprints near the perimeter of the clearing suggested that watchers remained, human, spectral, or both. Elena felt a chill. The forest had passed judgment during their excavation, allowing them to leave, but it had not released its presence entirely. The whispers of history lingered, a constant reminder that the past and present were entwined, that secrets could be revealed but never fully controlled. Elena reflected on the ethical weight of their discoveries. The ledger, skeletal arrangements, and artifacts exposed centuries of human behavior, ranging from devotion and ritual to calculated cruelty. They had uncovered not only history but patterns of secrecy and systemic violence, demonstrating how knowledge could be preserved and manipulated across generations. The emotional impact was profound. The excavation was no longer merely scientific, but an exploration of morality, memory, and the responsibility of those who uncover hidden truths. The final entries in the ledger, previously overlooked, provided a haunting perspective. Names appeared with cryptic symbols suggesting endings, transitions, or closure. Some seemed to indicate a deliberate conclusion to ritual practices, while others hinted at continuity, suggesting that the forces behind these burials had persisted, observing and preserving their own narratives. The message was unmistakable: the past was active, even if hidden, and those who dared to uncover it must tread carefully, balancing curiosity with reverence. As the team prepared to leave the clearing for the last time, Elena took a deep breath, feeling the forest around her as though it were both alive and sentient. Every shadow, every rustling leaf, and every whisper seemed to carry fragments of the stories they had unearthed. She understood that the forest and the mass grave were intertwined, forming a living monument to memory, secrecy, and consequence. Their excavation had been more than discovery, it had been a negotiation with time, history, and moral responsibility. In the fading light, Elena glanced back at the clearing, now quiet and still. The skeletal patterns remained perfectly arranged, the hidden box carefully buried nearby, and the ledger safely preserved. The forest had allowed their presence, judged their actions, and in its own enigmatic way, offered acknowledgement. The whispers of the forgotten lingered, a reminder that history is never truly silent, and that the past, once revealed, continues to speak in echoes, sometimes comforting, sometimes warning, always present. As they descended the narrow path back to the base camp, Elena felt the weight of everything they had uncovered settle into her bones. The mass grave had revealed the darkest aspects of humanity, yet also the resilience of memory, ritual, and documentation. The forest, with its shadows and whispers, had enforced lessons about respect, caution, and acknowledgement. They had become stewards of history, tasked with bearing witness to stories deliberately hidden and carefully preserved. The night enveloped them fully, the clearing disappearing behind a curtain of dense trees. But the echoes of the forgotten remained, imprinted in their minds, photographs, notes, and artifacts. Elena understood that the excavation had not closed the story, it had revealed it, offering clarity while leaving some mysteries intentionally unresolved. The watchers, the forest, and the ledger itself ensured that history would always retain a measure of control over those who sought to understand it. As the team reached the edge of the forest, Elena paused one final time. She traced her fingers over the ledger's worn cover, feeling the pulse of countless lives through its pages. A whisper of wind stirred, carrying an almost imperceptible murmur, like a voice of the past acknowledging their presence. She realized that the mass grave and the forest were not just remnants of history, they were custodians of memory, guardians of secrets, and bearers of lessons about humanity, power, and consequence. In that moment, Elena understood the final truth: the excavation had revealed what could be uncovered, honored what had been hidden, and ensured that the stories of the forgotten would endure. But the forest, the watchers, and the legacy of the mass grave reminded them that history is never fully controlled. It speaks, observes, and passes judgment in ways both subtle and profound. And for the team, the echoes of the forgotten would remain, haunting and instructive, for the rest of their lives.